Hello. I'm a fourth or fifth generation Angelino. My great-grandfather was born in Boyle Heights in 1899. So I guess my great-great-grandfather came here in 1870s from New Orleans. So my family has been in Los Angeles for a very, very long time, so I have a lot of good stories. Kind of like my focus, I'm a publisher of a community newspaper in Inglewood. It covers Inglewood, South LA, West Athens area, everything south of Slauson, and East of Crenshaw. So, and I also have a show, a podcast that I do. So I'm going to actually just go into the history of the police department, all police departments, because I think a lot of people don't really know how our police departments in the United States were founded. Because the point of the police is to protect rich, wealthy man's property and interest. Did you know, how did the St. Louis Police Department start? Who knows? I used to be a kindergarten teacher too. Do you know? Or you just...
Was it the Ku Klux Klan?
Actually, no, but you know what? That's good, I really appreciate it. But you're giving that answer. Actually, the St. Louis Police Department started off as Indian Patrol. So that's how the St. Louis Police Department started. Let's see here. Does anybody know when the first police department started? When it actually, the year it started? Nobody? Yes, go ahead.
1823.
It could be 1823. Depends on which number you want to use. So, but I mean, that's not like a common knowledge. Isn't that kind of interesting? Like, we don't really, the police is such a big deal in the United States that we don't know when it started, how did it start, did it just come out of thin air, or what happened? Well, the first publicly funded police department was in South Carolina in 1704. It was the Slate Patrol. So that was the first publicly funded police department in the United States. It was the Slate Patrol. The Slate Patrol emerged out of South Carolina in the early 1700s, but historical documents also identify the Slate Patrol in most parts of the southern region. The job of the Slate Patrol was to search slave quarters, keep slaves off the roadways, and disassemble meetings organized by groups of slaves. So it's like the same job the police department has now. But
The names were different.
The names were slightly different, but it's the exact same job. That's exactly what the point of the slave patrol was. So people kind of go, well, when slavery ended, like what happened? They just dismantled this organization. Well, the slave patrols remained in place during the Civil War. Keep in mind, I'm reading this book. This information is from Sally Hayden's book on slave patrol. You can just Google that. You'll find it. It's not that much information on it. But I'm just going to read a little bit from her book because I think it's an awesome book. It's really important in regards to knowing the history. But you can't really fight something if you don't know why it started. The slave patrol remained in place during the Civil War and were not completely disbanded after slavery. During early Reconstruction, several groups merged into what was formerly known as slave patrols to maintain control over African American citizens. Groups such as the federal military, the state militia, and the Ku Klux Klan took over responsibilities of earlier slave patrols and were known to be even more violent than their predecessors. Because of course, if you're the slave patrol, that's someone's property. You're not going to, beat somebody's property up. So, if they were, but after black people didn't learn it belonged to people anymore, then they didn't want to beat them up. I mean, they could do that. Over time, these groups began to resemble and operate similar to other newly established police departments in the United States. In fact, these people, David Barlow and Melissa Barlow, noted by 1837 the Charleston Police Department had 100 officers, and the primary function of this organization was slave patrol. These officers regulated the movement of slaves and free blacks, checking documents, enforcing slave codes, and guarding against slave revolts and catching runaway slaves. Scholars and historians assert the transition from slave patrol to publicly funded police agency was seamless in the southern United States. While some regard the slave patrol as the first formal attempt at policing, others identify the unification of the police departments in several major cities in the mid-1800s as a beginning point. For example, the New York Police Department was unified in 1845, St. Louis, the police department was unified in 1846, the Chicago in 1854, and the LAPD 1869. So it was either, depending on who you want to say started, it was either the slave patrol or the Indian patrol. Because if you look at St. Louis and Chicago, those were the people who were controlling the Indians. Look at the South, those are people who were controlling African Americans. So the point, the basis, the root of the police was to control African Americans and Native Americans So the root of it's there, and that's still kind of continuing today. And of course, a lot of these groups kind of founded vigilante groups. The most famous, maybe I should say infamous, vigilante group was the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the Night Riders. They would go out at midnight and terrorize black people and lynch them. We actually have a bicycle club now called the Midnight Riders. I don't know if they know that is the roots of that. I'm just saying, I don't think they're the roots of that, because that's kind of like that's kind of how that name kind of came about. The Klan would ride out in the middle of the night and go and try, and not try. They would actually accomplish killing black people. Let's see here. Oh, but somebody asked about the Ku Klux Klan and in regards to the police department. I think that person is gone now. But I just want to say, in 1871, Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act, which prohibited state actors, and state actors are police officers, from violating the civil rights of all citizens, in part because of law enforcement's heavy involvement with the infamous group. Of course, that law didn't actually change, but they had to actually make a law in 1870 saying you can't be part of the Klan. But as we know, those, I guess laws are made to be broken. They continue to work with the Klan, the police department, for a very long time. And to not leave out the Native Americans and Latinos, while the police department were working on African Americans, the state militias and all the state militias, the federal kind of like, what do you call it? The Border Patrol, they were working on the Latinos. So don't think, I'm right now I'm talking about African Americans, but it went, depending on which side that you were on, different departments continue to harass the same people. But I want to tell you something about, that was great about the LA. LAPD started to recruit officers from the South in 1950 when Chief Parker when Parker became the chief of police. And the thing about the thing that's so tragic was because Los Angeles was such an awesome place for African Americans in regards to freedom and diversity. I'm not saying it didn't have problems, because it's the United States that has problems. But when my great grandfather was born here, my great great grandfather came here, LA was just like this wonderful wonderland. They had like such awesome stories. My great grandfather, he had a bar in Los Angeles. He had one of the black and tan clubs. You can look those up actually. They had a lot of fun stuff going on. And actually, W.E. Du Bois said in 1913 in Crisis Magazine, which is a magazine that NAACP owned, that Los Angeles, the Negro in Los Angeles was, the best housed and had the best life. I mean, it was a quote, something like that. This is in 1913 Los Angeles. So for when Chief Parker did this, in regards to bringing these Southern police officers to Los Angeles, it was really to change the culture of the country, change the culture of the city, because in the 1940s, after World War II, more African Americans came, and you had different kind of mindset. You had people building up things. It's kind of like gentrification. You had people building, so they wanted to get rid of, they wanted to get rid of that kind of a feeling that was kind of going on. But I just want people to kind of get that feeling that while Los Angeles right now is kind of like the headquarters for all kind of police brutality, LA was not always like that. It didn't have the same roots as a lot of the places that were rooted in oppression. Los Angeles was not, like I said, it was the United States would have problems, but it wasn't as bad as other places. So another thing is kind of like, it's weird because after the 60s and the civil rights movement, and they kind of stopped harassing black people to the point of, they just stopped harassing black people. So it was like a little period, the 1960s to like the 1970s. And then in the 1970s, they start this propaganda for the drug war. So go back there. It was almost as if it was some kind of, how can I say, in regards to, it almost seems as if with the drug war, it wasn't about drugs. It was about, we need to go back to what we were doing before. I really view the prison industry as legalized slavery. And I think that one thing you really have to do, or people have to really do, is because I think a lot of people kind of go, in order to solve the drug war, what we need to do, or not drug war, but the war on drugs or the prison industrial complex, is what they need to do is get people to stop using drugs. like, yeah, so what we need to do is get people doing the right thing. Well, the thing is that people have used drugs for hundreds of years. People will always use drugs, and they're going to continue to use drugs. For you to say, in order to make the police, make the government stop doing horrible things, we need to get people doing more fun stuff instead of using drugs. No, people are going to jail, or people were going to jail for a joint. I mean, that's like people don't understand that there are a lot of black people who were going to jail for a joint. This is what you do. This is how you get people, you get your quota of people. You go to Skid Row, and you're the undercover cop. You go to Skid Row, you go, here, I'm gonna give you $20 for your joint. And then some drug addict person who's addicted to drugs is like, oh, okay, I want $20. Here's my joint. Okay, well you just bought yourself a 3-year trip to jail. So it's not people. That's even the thing too. Well, it's so important for people to be. I'm a journalist. I'm not a community organizer. I'm a journalist. I'm a writer. And I think the really important thing is how you shape a story. And I think it's really important. I always know I am not an organizer. I am a writer. But I think the most important thing is shaping the story. Even though I think it's really great when they show these criminals and they show them on different shows and documentaries, or they write about them, but they always kind of make it seem like, well, that guy was kind of bad anyway, though. I mean, he kind of went down the wrong way. If he had just, they don't say that, but they kind of imply that, because it's kind of like this idea, it's like this judgment, like, well, if he had just had an opportunity, if kids had just had an education, if he had just had a job, no. Just because you don't have a job, just because you use drugs, doesn't mean you should go to jail forever. Okay, that's crazy. When you went to jail, you were just a jerk. Okay, I'm not just jail. When you used lots of drugs, you were a jerk. You weren't a felon. Okay, like the person who was on heroin or people who smoked pot a lot, they were just like your annoying drunk uncle. They weren't felons. So now it's like you turn this person who was just used to be annoying into a felon. Let me kind of wrap this up. So the thing I think is the war on drugs started in the 70s. SWAT was used 42% of the time on African Americans and 12% of the time on Latinos. And I think the important thing to remember is kind of like what everybody else has kind of stated, this is not about one guy. That's why every time when there's something happens, LAPD always tries to point, oh, it's that one guy. Or anybody does anything, oh, it's that one guy. It's not the system. The system is fine. It's just, no, it's not. It's a system that was rooted in oppression. That's point of it is to oppress people. That's point of it is to protect rich people's interests. And it's kind of like this. Why is this kind of, important to you? Because people, well, I'm not black, I'm not Latino. We're just, in order to help people, we're just helping, we're just doing a service. No, not exactly. The cops have been the cops in the United States have had like 400 years to work out all the kinks in regards to breaking you down. They've been using black and brown people in order to test this out, and I pretty much think they're coming for you next. The United States is becoming, the United States, see, a long time ago, not a long time ago, the United States is not that old, but the middle class in the United States used to be important. And my mom was part of US, which is like the opposite of the Black Panthers. If you guys know the whole story, it's a big long story, I won't go into it, but it's like the Black Panthers, us anyway. So the thing about, in regards to, let me get back to my point. Oh yes, so a lot of times when people thought you shouldn't vote. That's my whole point. A lot of people kind of go, a lot of people who are radical are very much, you vote with your wallet, right? People say that? You vote with your wallet, that's the most important thing. It's more important than going to the ballot box. Well, a lot of people kind of think that. A lot of people were kind of on that vote with your wallet because voting is not important, it's totally pointless and all this stuff. Well, that might have worked when the United States was this, the biggest middle class in the world. But the United States is no longer, there's middle classes in Asia that are bigger, there are middle classes in Africa that are bigger. So in regards to you voting with your wallet, that's not going to exactly work anymore. And that's also the problem is, the United States doesn't view white people who are not rich, they don't view you as a friend now. You are also a problem. That you want rights, you want the Koch brother to get out of the elections, you don't want, you want to see the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you want to see all the stuff, you want to stop fracking, that's a problem.
Are many of the things that have been done to third world nations, some of those policies are now being visited upon the population here?
Yeah, it is, and the reason, yeah, so the thing is that because you're a problem, the things that they were doing to everybody else who used to be a problem, they're gonna start doing to you. And in regards to how you vote for policies, not maybe so much you, but how a lot of people vote for policies, and they even had they did a study, and a lot of people, white people will vote for policies if they think it's going to hurt people of color. So, but the thing is that when you vote for policies like that, whether people or laws, what you do is you're kind of setting up the government to oppress you, because whoever they can oppress, they can easily move that on to you. So that's pretty much my whole point. I hope I didn't go on too long. About it. That's the thing people always say, that people are afraid. I don't think that the system of racism and oppression is afraid of black men. I think what it is black people, because we are the smallest group and we are the most visible group, it's a very good group to use as an example of what can happen to you. And I think that's why when I was talking, people kind of go, in regards to black people, the thing is they can always go, if you don't act right, this is what we're going to do to you. You know, so they can use like black men, and they walk around the street like you're not behaving, whatever, we can beat you up. But then you can always go, it's kind of just a good way, because you can brutalize the black community, but not really scare people who are not part of the black community that much, because you're like, well, I'm not black, I don't have to worry about that. But you know, if you don't act right, this is what we can. It's kind of like showing this is what we can do. This is a power that we have. The United States government uses Doccupy, for example, to go, this is what we're not going to do this to you because you're white, so I'm totally not going to do this to you. But I want you to know that if I need to do this, here's an example of what I can do to you if I feel like it. But don't worry, it's not going to happen to you because you're white.
Yeah.
So that's what I think about that.
Yes, sir.
I've been around, I can remember as far back as the 60s, when they had the message boards. And they'd always go into the poorest neighborhoods, and get the most brutal officers, and they gave free reign to do whatever they wanted to, and they knew that it didn't matter if people complained because poor people were powerless. How do we deal with this if we're still dealing with the same thing?
I think, how do you deal with that? Well, the one thing I did was I started a newspaper. And not only did I start a newspaper and I publicized it. I make an effort, because a lot of ethnic media stays within the ethnic community. So you have a black newspaper, if you're not black, you never see that. You never see what's happening because it's an ethnic newspaper. But what I've learned is that if you want your community to have power, not only do you inform your community, but you make sure that everybody else knows what's happening. Every time my mayor, I'm in Inglewood, Mayor Butts, who likes to violate people's civil rights, every time he does something, every time I write about him, I send that link. I have it in paper and print, but I also send that link to everybody who I can. I send it to the DA. I send it to, the different reporters. I send it to police departments. I send it to every single journalist that I know. So I think a way to keep your community safe, if you're a community that is oppressed or isolated, because that's the thing too, they try to isolate people, is by making sure everybody knows what's happening. Documenting and making sure everybody knows what's happening, and also making sure you have an actual press. Because that's one thing they also try to do. If you're a person of color or if you're a woman, the first thing that the corporate media tries to say, oh, she's an organizer. That way it's kind of like neutralizing your voice. You're not really a journalist. You're not really objective. The only people who actually count in regards to their side of the story or their perspective are white men who work for the LA Times. Because also too, if you're a woman and you work for the Times, you're probably writing about art or music or something like, or fashion. That's another, they like to push you in, because when I first started out writing, I remember the editor, because also too, they have if you're writing about economics or politics, there's a certain way that they want you to look. Even if I wasn't African American, they're like, oh my God, look at you, you're like all, dressed up. I always dressed kind of, unique, right? So they were just kind of like, you should write about music or art. You would do really well if you just, write about something more fun. But I think it's really important for communities of color and for women but not, for Black people, Latino people, and for women to write about politics, to write about economics, to write about policy, because the only people who are telling those stories are guys. And they're guys from a certain class, and they're guys from a certain race. And because that's the only people who tell the story, that's exactly how the story becomes the truth, or, they decide they decide who's telling the truth.
Right on.
Yeah.
Real quickly, I want to thank you, Tika. Let's give it up. I can't recommend enough the podcast, Black Girl Show, and the listing is on your handout. By the way, we are offering these t-shirts that Mike was wonderful enough to make. These are Know Your Rights t-shirts. We're looking for a donation for
MP Chronicle presents The Black Girl Show, 7 p.m. Pacific Time, 10 p.m. Eastern Time on LA Talk Live.